the biggest one that's on record at this point?
2,300 acres.
Jeez.
That it covers there, and it weighs 35,000 tons.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Sciencentric podcast. As always, I'm your host, Eric Olson. Before we dive into the main interview of this episode, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is, if you're watching on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. And the second thing is, if you like this content that we produce, there are a couple different ways that you can support us. One is through Patreon. We have a couple of different benefit levels. So if you sign up, you can support us each month, and you'll get some benefits like early access to new episodes, ad-free episodes, and also a monthly private Q&A with me for patrons only. You can find out how to do that by looking for links in the YouTube description, or head over to sciencentric.com/support. Our guest for this episode is Keith Seifert. He's a Canadian mycologist who spent more than 40 years studying fungi on 5 continents. He's done research on microscopic fungi from farms, forests, food, and the built environment, as well as studied ways of reducing fungal toxins and diseases affecting plants and animals. He's a former president of the International Mycological Association, an executive editor of Mycologia, and an associate editor of several other scientific journals. So, Keith, so glad to have you here, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
Awesome. I also just forgot to mention that you have a book coming out soon called The Hidden Kingdom of Fungi.
I say fungi.
Fungi, okay.
Yeah, but a lot of people say fungi, so a lot of people say fungi. It's
This gets into the kind of GIF area of disagreement on pronunciation, I think.
Latin and Greek and Oxford and Cambridge.
There you go. Cool. So, well, anyways, thanks so much for speaking with me. And I guess my first question for you is, I think a lot of people, when they think about we'll say fungi for this interview, fungi, they think about mushrooms, and that's about as far as their knowledge goes. So maybe you could give us, a little bit of an overview of what fungi is, and also why are people unfamiliar with it compared to other groups of organisms, or why do you think? Yeah,
there's a lot of layers buried in those questions, but to a biologist, fungi are a kingdom or a domain, or there's other names that are used for it, but somehow equivalent to plants and animals. So they used to be considered plants when I was in university. They were still being taught in botany courses, but that really has come apart now, and fungi are their own kingdom, equivalent to plants and animals. And I think so that explains part of the reason that people didn't really focus on them very much, because they were a subset of botany or of plants. Mm-hmm. So, but on the other hand, the book is called The Hidden Kingdom, and I'm certainly not the inventor of that phrase. A lot of people refer to the fungi as the hidden kingdom because they are among us, they are everywhere, but we really don't see them. And what we do see are the mushrooms that pop up, or the molds that pop out on our bread or on our compost and things like that. So when we see them, we tend to be surprised because they didn't seem like they were there yesterday, and then all of a sudden here they are. And it's kind of like an analogy is plant roots. Some plants overwinter just as the roots and they're under the ground and nobody sees them, and in the spring they pop out again, and that's kind of what the story is with mushrooms, and to a certain extent with molds too. Instead of roots, they're cylindrical cells that we call hyphae, and that's a characteristic aspect of what a fungus is. They build themselves out of tubes, and that's quite different from plants, which build themselves out of bricks, if you want to think of it that way, or people, animals, which are kind of built like bags of water around the skeleton or inside a shell. So that's one thing that makes the fungi, and that's one of the things that makes them so interesting, because they are so, their mode of moving around and the whole nature of what their body is very different than ours. We always have the same body, or at least we think we do, and the trees outside the window here seem to stay the same through their whole lives, but fungi just kind of spread and change shape and move around all of the time. And another thing that's most people know about, I think, is the spores. So that's their reproductive system, is by sending out balloons, kind of. And so they move around that way, and they make lots of spores. There's counts of, hundreds of thousands of spores in a cubic yard of air, in moldy environments, for example. So there's that.
So I think one of the points you make in the book is that fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Is that correct?
Right. From an evolutionary perspective, that's now shown to be the case. And the irony again that they used to be sort of taught in amongst as if they were plants, but actually they're closer to us from an evolutionary perspective. So plants divided away from us before fungi did.
Yeah. So in terms of mobility and things like that, when we think about plants, we tend to think that as these kind of hard, the cells are kind of rigid and they don't move so much. And then animals are very mobile. Are fungi sort of somewhere in the middle in terms of mobility? Or
I think they're closer to what you would think of the plants in terms of speed. They don't run around the way that we do, and even a fast fungus, whether it's a fast growing hypha or something else, is only going to grow an inch a day. So they're not running around, but they do get up into the jet stream, and they do move around the world that way in the air. So from that perspective, they can get around in ways that we can't.
Yeah, I guess you could say that's somewhat true of plants as well, and that they produce seeds or things that kind of fly through the air.
It's similar.
Obviously we don't, but
normally we don't. No.
Normally, yes, without a lot of help.
Yeah.
So another thing that I thought was interesting about fungi is that you spend a lot of time in the book talking about yeast,
right?
In particular. So yeast, I believe, are single-celled organisms, but then you have fungi that go all the way up to these giant underground colonies. It seems like, in terms of size, that fungi have this huge range. But people typically think of that middle range of a mushroom, but it seems like it really covers as wide a spectrum as the other kingdoms in terms of size.
It surprised people when it was about 1990, I think, that this humongous fungus was discovered in Michigan, and it was kind of a shock even to the people who discovered it. But it's a different kind of thing, and the analogy I would use is that just if you could imagine cloning humans like they do in science fiction films, so you've got different human bodies walking around, but if they hold hands with each other, they join together, and they become one. And so that's what the deal is with the humongous fungus. It's not one body that just grew out and filled all of these acres. It's lots of bodies that were clones, and they joined together and formed this kind of network body. So it's a totally different idea of what an individual is than. And I like to have games sometimes with students or an audience, sort of imagining what would that would be like. Every time you held hands with somebody, you stuck together, and then how easy would it be to organize that group to get out of the room,
Right. So you become this kind of super organism. Could you just say what the humongous fungus is? Because I'm not sure that everybody listening would necessarily know what that is.
So there's a group of mushrooms called honey mushrooms. Armillaria is the Latin name, but they're called honey mushrooms because the cap kind of looks like the crystals of honey on the cap. And they're tree pathogens. So they attack trees and they get involved with the root systems, and then they send out these things that look like shoelaces, and they just spread that way. And so they and then they join together and they make these large complex individuals. And it's not
what's the biggest one that's on record at this point?
Right now, it's there's one in Oregon. I think it's Malheur National Forest or Malheur. I'm not sure how it would be said, and it's 2,300 acres. Jeez. That it covers there, and it weighs 35,000 tons.
Wow!
So that's a lot of hidden fungus.
So
but all the people would just see the mushrooms popping up, every fall or every summer.
Now, is that sort of humongous fungus? Are all those? Is it all genetically the same thing, or are they just closely related in terms of, that's individual organisms?
They are not necessarily genetically closely related. They are genetically closely related. They're not necessarily identical, like 100% of all genes in the genome. There are genes in fungi, just as there are in plants, humans rather, that like with organ transplants, you have to have a close match or a blood transfusion. Those are what we call self-recognition genes. So in this fungus, the self-recognition genes have to be identical, otherwise they can't join together. So that much of them is identical. And then, the rest of them may have a little bit of variation here, but it's a very small percentage that's different. So that's what we call clones in that sense.
Yeah. So that's 30. You said 35,000 tons.
35,000 tons. Yeah.
That's insane. So that's like that's got the animal largest animal organism beat by a lot, which is the blue whale, I believe. So
yeah, there's kind of a running joke in biology about using the blue whale as a unit of mass, and so this weighs 200 blue whales.
200 blue whales. Yeah, there you go. Amazing. But as you said, it's hidden. I mean, aside from its spore producing mushrooms, you just don't see it. So that's on the big end of the spectrum. But then we have on the small end of the spectrum, we have these yeast, which are really interesting. And I don't think that most people think of yeast as fungi.
Probably they think about it very much.
Yeah.
I think everyone knows about yeast, but
but they have this amazing. They're so useful for us, particularly when it comes to food items. So what are some of the things that we eat on a common or on a regular basis that involve yeast?
Right. So
it's quite a long list.
Yeah, there are. It is a long list, and the famous yeast is called the sugar yeast or brewer's yeast or baker's yeast. I called it the brewer's yeast in the book because that's the oldest use of it is for brewing, but it's one species or a species in quotation marks, and it's called Saccharomyces, which means sugar fungus, and so it has a long history of being involved with humans. And there's a theory out there called the drunken ape theory that man humanity centralized its civilization in order to have grain so that they could brew.
Uh,
It, it's a fun theory, and it tends to be domestication is through the eye of the beholder. So from our perspective, we domesticated yeast, but from the yeast perspective, they may think they domesticated us, because they've certainly done very well from us in terms of expanding their population. You do find this fungus out in the wild, but really you find it in beer, wine, and bread, those are the three big ones. But it's also involved even in soy sauce manufacture to a small extent, and in chocolate fermentation. It's just a fungus. This yeast is a fungus, and it just has talents that we like. So when it gets into say grape must or malted barley or something like that, we like what it does, and so we don't try to stop it from that. And
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there's estimates that the value of the yeast economy on the planet is 10% of human economic activity. And that's really strange to think about it from that perspective. And I'm not an economist, but that doesn't seem far off to me.
I think you're right when you talk about beer and bread and cheese and wine, and that's sort of all things that people like that also generate a lot of money. So that makes sense. So one thing I always wonder about is you have this yeast that's naturally occurring, doesn't really, I don't think, occurs in large quantities or anything like that. So how did humans get mixed up with yeast? Do we have any sense of that, about how that relationship evolved?
Well, this species and the other related species are found in plant nectar and in tree sap, and they also get into the intestines of beetles and other insects. So probably their natural cycle is something like that, from the nectar of the flower into the beetle, and the beetle flies away and drops some yeast cells in the next flower that it. But when you're a single cell organism like that, your lifespan's very short from a certain perspective, hours maybe, but they don't really have lifespans like we do because they just keep dividing. So it's each cell may only be a couple of hours old, but nobody's died. They've just split into multiple individuals, but what the real advantage for yeast when they got involved with humans is that we're willing to feed them. We're willing to give them a big batch of sugar water, and instead of a little dribble in the middle of a flower. I mean, and then when they run out of food, we just move them off and give them some more food. So the archaeology suggests that humans have been brewing for about 10,000 years or longer. And this is done by looking at shards of pots, clay vessels from archaeological sites, and they find the chemical fingerprints of these metabolites. So not just the alcohol, which would go just float away, but other compounds that are high in wines and beers that give it color and so on.
Is there something unique to fungi about yeast specifically, about what it produces that makes things taste so good? Are there certain compounds that it creates that say plants or bacteria don't create that make it so delicious? Because like all of those things you listed are pretty much delicious, right? So
Sure.
and fungi themselves are too. I mean, my 10-year-old son would disagree with that, but we love eating mushrooms, for example. So is there something they're making that's adding to this flavor of food?
Well, there are other organisms that make alcohol, so it's not just the alcohol. It's definitely the best at making large quantities of alcohol. So for that reason, if we're focused on alcohol, that's a good choice. But they also make a lot of we call them aromatic compounds. So they're small organic molecules. They like 6 to 10 carbons or something, maybe more than that. But they're small enough that they get out into the air, and so we can smell them. And not all of these things smell good, but the combination of them tends to be pleasant to us, and it probably also attracts insects. Thinking back to their original habitat, that they would be calling the insects by sending out these sweet, fruity smells. And
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe they have some symbiotic relationship with plants as well, that they're helping the plants to, bring insects, pollinators to them or something like that.
It could, yeah. I don't know that anybody's really thought of that one in terms of being a symbiosis.
Yeah,
That's an interesting one. I hadn't really thought about that. I'm more focused on our symbiosis.
yeah. Hey, it's a paper I just gave you.
Yeah,
I want a co-author credit on that.
Okay, no problem. Well, one of the things I could say about yeast that kind of carries over into another part of the food story is that
Yeah,
yeast don't make toxins that affect us. And,
right.
and so from that point of view, they're a really banal or harmless thing for us. There are people who get kind of hypersensitivity to it and so on, but really yeast are harmless to us. You can't say that for every fungus that's growing on food.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually to talk about, the other way that people know about fungi, and you hear about this every year. There's somebody that dies from eating poisonous mushrooms. So, is there any particular reason why fungi are, why some of them are so poisonous, or is that why did they evolve that way? It seems like it's there's some particularly toxic mushrooms out there.
Yeah. Probably most of the really toxic chemicals that they produce are aimed at insects and to a certain extent at other animals, and a lot of them are probably, they call it resource guarding or resource sequestering. If you're growing in a particular place, one way to stop anybody else from moving in is just to saturate the environment with something annoying or something toxic, and so they're constantly at war with bacteria also. So that's where the antibiotics come from.
Yeah.
But there's some really bizarre things with the fungal toxins in animals, and I was reading something. You're in New York. I was reading something about the mice in New York City in Central Park. There's a fungal toxin called aflatoxin. It's a really nasty toxin, and it kills as many people as malaria does on the world scale. But it's more or less under control in North America, but when people throw away their food in Central Park and they throw it into the garbage cans, the mice eat this food and they get exposed to aflatoxin. And there's these populations of field mice at Central Park, and some of them have developed some resistance to aflatoxin. It's just amazing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. They're always. I feel like that population of animals living in New York City is evolving to faster than other other animals in other parts of the world, just because it's such a strange environment.
Yeah.
And different pressures and things like that. So yeah, that's a real common one. Also, not just poisons in mushrooms, but yeah, it's aflatoxin.
Aflatoxin. Yeah.
And that's commonly found in peanuts, correct?
Yeah, it's peanuts and maize or corn, as you say in the U.S. corn, and it's a big problem with American corn actually in the southern states where it's warmer. But the regulatory system handles it more or less. So it doesn't really enter the human food chain very much in our countries. The problem is if people decide, well, I can't sell this for human food, and they feed it to their animals, and then that kind of causes a separate sort of series of problems that may not be direct toxicity to us, but
yeah. I mean, I think this also kind of brings up the idea of, people not necessarily thinking about molds as being fungus. It's just it's more of an inconvenience, but it's also just that the thing that I really took away from your book is just that there's fungus like everywhere, all around us, dust, it's growing on us, it's growing in us. It's something we don't think about, but it really is like pretty much everywhere, and part of our everyday existence. The
point of the book, the focus of the book, is kind of different than the other books that are out there about fungi, because I really wanted to focus on where they were in the human environment and how they interacted with us and how we reacted with them. And at the same time, I wanted people not to be totally shocked by that. I wanted them to realize that there's good things about it and there's bad things about it, and it's useful for us to know both. We be aware that there's good things and there's bad things. And you mentioned mushroom poisoning a few times, and I needed to include that a bit in the book, because I think there's a lot of kind of folk medicine tales about eating wild mushrooms, and more in the United States and in Canada now, there are people who are going out and eating mushrooms, and part of that is because of the cultural diversification that's occurred in the last 50 years or so. That people are coming in from other countries where eating mushrooms is just part of their world and part of their culture, and so that's kind of integrating into our culture, but also there's just an interest in biodiversity and nature, and so there's more people that are going out to collect mushrooms, and I really encourage people who are interested to go out rather than buying a book and trying to identify things themselves. They could join a mycological society. There's a fantastic one in New York. And,
I've heard of that. Yeah,
and they're very welcoming people, a very, very diverse group of people brought together by this common interest, and they learn by sharing with each other. It's really great. I mean, I learned when I was a student, I learned mushroom identification by joining a mycological club. And for people in other cities, there's a list on the North American Mycological Association's homepage of all of the mycological societies around Canada and the U.S. And in Europe, the European Mycological Association has a list on their website. So,
yeah, that reminded me. So when I worked in science, I worked in a genetics lab, and I had a Russian lab mate who got into mushroom hunting. And I remember one time he brought back a bunch of what he said were chanterelle mushrooms, and I know nothing about mushroom hunting or anything like that, but he gave me some of them, and I was like, oh, thanks, Roman. Anyways, long story short, I waited a couple of days before I tried them. I wanted to make sure that he tried them first, and it was fine. But you mentioned in the book there's something that you should do in terms of, making sure mushrooms are safe before you consume them.
Yeah, I mean, you should know what they are, but even then, people react differently to eating mushrooms. If you have an individual response to it, there are people who have allergies to certain foods and perhaps to mushrooms. So, like the rule of thumb is, try one and wait a couple days and make sure that it's not having any unexpected, unwelcome effects. And at the same time you do that, make sure that you keep some around, so that if something does go wrong, that you can contact poison control, and they have something to work with about what you've eaten. Not I thought I ate this, but they can usually consult with an expert pretty efficiently. They have people on call for mushroom poisoning, and so they can deal with it. But usually when you learn mushrooms, you learn the poisonous ones first. Mm-hmm. And then once you know the poisonous ones, then it's a bit safer to wander out a little bit. And there's a few really easy mushrooms to recognize, like the oyster mushroom, for example, that you can buy in the grocery store now, and morels, which I don't think they're quite out in your area yet. They're maybe a few more weeks, but they're pretty hard to mix up with anything else. It's possible, but
what are the ones that are typically problematic that people consume?
Well, the real bad ones are called Amanita, and they have a variety of common names like Destroying Angel or Angel of Death, that kind of. Usually the names are pretty descriptive. Like if you knew that you had the Angel of Death, you wouldn't try it, But the thing is, they're quite common and they're very beautiful. So people pick them because of that. They're very noticeable, and so that. All over the world, those tend to be the ones that uninformed people would try because they think it looks something like the store-bought mushroom, but it looks different, but maybe that's just because it's wild, And then other than that, there are others that are poisonous, a few that are deadly and so on, but they're not the kind of thing that the average person is likely to eat. Somebody who's in a mushroom frame of mind might decide to eat them, but it's really the amanitas that are the problem, and there's basically no cure. The compounds that are in there are really nasty. They shut down the your liver and kidneys, and there's not a lot that can be done other than an organ transplant.
Wow. So once you know how to identify those, then you're a little bit. It's a little bit safer because those sound like the worst ones.
Yeah, and the other thing about eating wild mushrooms is that some of them really don't taste very good. They taste unexceptional. So there's a few. Most people eat like 5 species. They're really nice ones. Chanterelles are one that you mentioned. Morels, oyster mushrooms, maybe a few of the field mushrooms that are similar to the agaricus that you buy in the grocery store. And most people are quite content with that because they taste good. You can make really interesting kind of recipes with them, and there's hardly any need to go any broader than that unless you're really curious and looking for a lot of nuances in flavor.
Is there a particular reason that those Amanita, the Angel of Death mushrooms, are so poisonous? Is it known? Or are they have some sort of natural predator that wants to eat them?
There may have been some research on that, and mushrooms tend to get kind of maggots in the caps, so they may be an anti-insect thing. Squirrels can eat them, some of them, and they don't seem to get affected, and so the toxicity is often quite species specific, and we eat some things, like chocolate, for example, it's poisonous to dogs,
Right.
So it's just the luck of the draw, and or the bad luck of the draw for Amanita if we eat them. They're not kind for people.
So one thing you didn't really talk about in the book at length was psychedelic mushrooms. That's another kind of class of mushrooms that's not going to kill you, but it can send you on kind of a wild ride. Is it the same kind of thing there that these psychoactive compounds are also like a deterrent to predators?
Yeah, that's a good one. Good question. The magic mushroom psychoactive compound, one of them is called psilocybin, and it's been found in other fungi that are pathogens of insects, which again makes me think that they're probably an insect. They're probably aimed at the insects, and their effects on humans are probably just accidental, not by any evolutionary design. There are some people who think that there is like a higher purpose involved, but that's not my subject. So,
Yeah.
but and then there are other fungi that I do mention ergot in the book, and that's the other big
Right.
psychedelic compound. LSD is derived. It's a chemical derivative of a natural compound from ergot, which is a grain disease, and that did have a lot of effects in the Middle Ages on people who were eating rye bread and things made from rye, and they didn't know that these black spikes that were in there weren't part of the plant, and they had quite severe hallucinations and gangrene and things like that.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But modern medicine, I'm sure you've seen the stories in the last 5 years or so. These compounds are being decriminalized, and they are being tested experimentally for various psychological, like at a lower dose, not as hallucinogens, but as sort of medicines for people who have psychological distress of various kinds.
Yeah, that's pretty cool to see, actually. I think there's some therapeutic controlled environments when you take those things that can really be helpful. I know they're doing that also with MDMA and some other things like that. So yeah, that's pretty cool. So are these mushrooms trying to send, insects on a, magic carpet ride, or what's the, or maybe they work in a different way in insects, and it, like you said, it's just some kind of accidental thing. But I'm envisioning, grasshoppers flying around just out of their minds, like.
Well, to stick with the insect, like you've probably heard of zombies, right?
Yes.
A different group of fungi again, but these are fungi that attack ants and beetles and things like that, and they basically turn them into robots at their command, and so an ant that's infected by one of these fungi will climb a plant and get it as high up as it possibly can, and then it will die, and the fungus will cement it to the plant, and then it will shoot a stalk out of its head and throw its spores in the air. And what this tells me is that these are very psychoactive compounds in general. So that and that may be the purpose of making them, is to ensure the survival of the fungus. Mm-hmm. That it needs to get out of the insect somehow, and one way to do it is to make the insect go where the spore dispersal will be the most effective.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of messing with creating compounds that mess with its, behavior, and then that behavior leads to better reproduction, and then over many cycles that sort of gets reinforced, right? Is that
I suppose
something like that? Is that the cordyceps fungus that you're talking about?
Yeah, cordyceps, Ophiocordyceps. There's two are now. And one of them is one of those fungi, and one of these compounds. It's the fungus is called Talipocladium, but it's one of these zombie fungi, and it makes a compound called Cytosporine A. It's a bizarre molecule. Peptides are what make up proteins, but this molecule is a circle of peptides, and this is probably an antifungal product in nature. That's probably why it's doing it in this case, is to combat against other fungi. But it's what makes organ transplants possible for humans.
Oh, wow.
Which is certainly not the intention of the fungus. But anyway, this has been one of the most successful antibiotics apart from penicillin. Fungi, because I don't know how old you are, but I was when I was a kid, 10 years old was when the first heart transplant was. So in the last 50 years, 40 years, all kinds of organ transplants have become possible, and it's possible because of cyclosporin.
It seems like fungi are just these master sort of converters. Like they can convert, so many different molecules into other molecules. I mean, is that a good way to think about them?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it, and it ties back a little bit to our close relationship with them, from a evolutionary perspective, because compounds that they make for biological reasons that affect the behavior, their own behavior, may also affect our behavior, because we have this kind of biochemical similarity to them. And I think that's why we get interesting drugs from them. But also, if we happen to get a fungal infection, it can be kind of difficult to get rid of it, because things that are toxic to fungi are often toxic to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. If we're more alike, then something toxic to us toxic to them would be toxic to us. That makes total sense. I mean, we talked a little bit about poison in mushrooms, but also, like you mentioned, this cyclosporin and then penicillin. I think people don't realize. I think a lot of people would not realize that comes from a fungus. And which fungus does that come from?
Well, it comes from a fungal. The genus name is Penicillium.
Well, there you go.
Little brush. and people often just mix the two words together. They think that penicillin is a fungus, but it's not. It's a metabolite of Penicillium. And there's lots of Penicillium species. So there's a group of about 5 or 6 of them that make this compound penicillin. And I'm really interested in the history of science and how scientists get along and don't get along with each other. And penicillin, the discovery of penicillin, is a really interesting story from that perspective, and it ties right into the history of the Second World War very tightly, because the Allies had penicillin and the Germans didn't, and so right. It became a lot of espionage and a lot of kind of attempts to control the research that was being done on penicillin at that time, so they could get it out to the soldiers.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think before that, right, the only thing maybe they had access to in terms of antibiotics were like sulfa drugs or something like that, right? I think those. Yeah,
and at that time they'd been around for about 30 or 40 years, and they worked pretty well, I think, but they had a lot of side effects as well, and they some of them were injected and some of them were just used as powder and kind of spread directly onto wounds and so on. It was they're still used a little bit, but not so much.
Yeah, I think maybe still used for like intestinal things. I remember somebody taking sulfa drugs maybe for something like that. But yeah, penicillin was like a game changer, right?
Yeah, it was a natural product in that sense. Although it's been modified chemically to be a more efficient, to be more soluble, so we can get into and more stable, so it can get into our blood and so on.
And so this penicillium, is it classified as a mold or as a?
Well, it's Ascomycetes mold, so it belongs to half of the fungi we call Ascomycetes, and then it's really the quintessential mold. The green mold that you see growing on bread and apples and things like that. That's one of the Penicillium species. It's not that particular one. That one is kind of a house dust fungus. The Penicillium, what's it called nowadays? Rubens.
So this naturally occurring fungus, though, is probably not making enough of the metabolite penicillin for it to really have an effect, right? So it's like if you're eating moldy bread, that's not going to give you antibiotic resistance or anything like that, right?
Oh no! I mean, there's sort of cryptic stories from the 1800s and so on of people rubbing moldy bread on wounds and stuff like that. But I wouldn't recommend that now. And the issue with moldy food is that many of the compounds, many of the chemicals that these fungi make are not harmless. They are harmful. And so it's really risky to eat moldy food unless you know what the mold is. So with the cheeses, for example, blue cheese and camembert, we know what the mold is. It's supposed to be there. It's not making any toxins. It's just doing nice things, and that's okay. But if you buy some cheese that's not supposed to be moldy and it becomes moldy, well, then it's a risk to eat that.
Yeah. So this penicillium, though, that's the same or similar that makes penicillin is the bacteria that you find on those cheeses you mentioned, like blue cheese and stuff like that. It's the same family or whatever.
Same genus.
There's genus, yeah.
Penicillium so Penicillium roqueforti is the blue cheeses, and Camembert is the soft white cheeses.
One thing you mentioned about not eating moldy food that I really took away from the book was that when you see when you have a cheese in your fridge and it's getting moldy, you can't just scrape that mold off, right? You don't know how far in this hyphae penetrate into the center of the cheese. So it's not like you should be eating that.
That's the hidden kingdom part of things, right? They're hidden down in there, and you're just seeing the top layer. But they also, these toxins sort of exude out. They kind of diffuse out from where the fungus is, and they are also sending enzymes out that are breaking down the lipids, the fats in the cheese. And so you can see that if you hold it in the right light. You see that the reflection of light off the surface of the cheese and maybe the texture of the cheese has changed a bit, and you see that well beyond where you just see the spores. Mm-hmm. So I always tell people that moldy food is unsuitable for consumption, and that's a really good rule of thumb.
Yeah. Although I guess somebody had to be first, the first person to try blue cheese or the first person to try camembert, right?
Yeah. There's a story about that in the book, yeah.
So, but maybe you don't want to go first. So, one other thing I really wanted to talk or to ask you about is some of the cool, interesting things people are doing with fungi in terms of building things and making new materials. Could you just maybe mention some of the really interesting projects that people are working on? Making new materials. I thought that was so interesting. And they're biodegradable, right? So these are natural products. So
there's mostly it ties back into one of the very first things we talked about, which was the hypha, the cylindrical cell, and so it's a microscopic thing. You don't see it, but that's how a fungus grows, and so that's different than building things out of blocks or bags again, and so people are taking advantage of that because it can they can interweave with each other, and so there's a whole, just about anything you can imagine, people have tried to make it out of fungus now. So for textiles, fungal leather, there's some very serious efforts going on there, and even there's one. I think this is more of an artistic statement, but there's somebody who has a mushroom burial suit, so that you can wear, after you're dead, they can wrap you in this mushroom suit, and then it will assist with your decomposition. But actually, a lot of these kind of really weird things are more kind of artistic kind of statements, but there are some very serious things going on. So I think that the textile thing, for sure, there's going to be some movement on that. Right now, it's mostly in the fashion industry, where that, because they're not really that cheap to make yet, that people are playing with that.
So how do you make fungal leather? I mean, that doesn't sound possible.
Well, I think the way that they do it is they grow a bunch of filamentous fungus, and I think they're probably mostly using mushrooms in this case, like the oyster mushroom, or there's one called reishi, which is a kind of more medicinal mushroom, because they know how to grow them in liquid, and so they will harvest this growth either by spinning it down or running it through a filter of some kind, and then they will try to reorient the strands in some way. So, and most of this is proprietary, so there's not a lot of publications on this in scientific literature, so you don't know exactly what they're doing. But there's a lot of videos on YouTube about it. You can kind of get a feel for what they're doing. And then there's a lot of building materials that are being investigated in that way too. So some of it is packing. So instead of using styrofoam, the idea is to either make fungal pellets, or else to actually grow the fungus around whatever it is you're trying to package, so that it's a real close fit that protects whatever it is you're trying to protect. Mm-hmm. And then they have to kill the fungus in some way, because you can't go sending these things around the world. That's not acceptable really at the moment to do that. But as long as it's dead, and they do some kind of process with heat or who knows what else to stabilize it so that the shape doesn't change. Mm-hmm. And then the idea is when you're finished with it, that you just throw it into the dump and it's biodegradable, which is probably true, as long as whatever they did to make it, to kill it or make it dimensionally stable isn't harmful.
I mean, that's my other thought with that is just that the way that it seems like fungi can lose a lot of water and kind of go into this dormant state, and then it's like if you added back water, it would just come back alive and start growing again, which is not what you want to happen especially with a clothing, that it starts growing up.
But this question of water is really interesting in this case too. If you look at these kind of boutique biotechnologies, because there's people, just like they're trying to make meat in a petri dish, there's people who are trying to make products out of fungal cells and texture them and flavor them so that they seem like food. And that's what's really interesting about that is, if you think about a cow, a cow you have to grow for a year and a half, 2 years, whatever. It takes a lot of feed, it takes a lot of water, and a lot of energy to raise that food, that protein. But for a fungus, you may get the same amount of stuff in 2 or 3 weeks. So the saving in energy and water can be huge. And then it's just a matter of convincing people that it's something they want to eat.
Is there some advantage that fungi have over plants in terms of growing these new materials or growing food Do they grow faster? They use less resources, or are they kind of on par?
So with the fungi, you'd be growing them in a liquid vat. So if you've ever been to a brewery or a winery, like there's these huge tanks called fermenters, and they're filled with sugar water. Basically, I mean, other nutrients are in there, and the fungi grow in there.
Mm-hmm.
So you can use waste materials. So they, for biofuels, for example, they tend to use waste fiber from agricultural production. So what's left over from the corn plant after the cobs are taken off, or the parts of the sugar cane that are not used to produce sugar, and so that provides the what they call a feedstock for the growth of mycelium. In that way, plants can be grown that way too. Like algae are grown, and that's part of the biofuel system as well. So, but what we think of as plants, the land plants, they can be grown hydroponically, but not really with the same ease that fungi and bacteria can be.
So, I mean, that to me seems like the biggest advantage is that you can take, waste from growing food and then turn that again into something that's useful versus taking up land that might have been used for agriculture and then turning that into, some place that, for growing fungi, right? I mean, it's like you're taking, wood waste or corn waste and you can turn it into something useful, right? I mean, is that the advantage for fungi versus other means of creating these materials? I mean, obviously with like plastics, they're not biodegradable, so that's a big deficit. But I'm just trying to like kind of tease out what advantage fungi have versus like say growing, trees or something like that.
Yeah, part of it is the ability that they can grow on what we consider waste. That's definitely helpful, and part of it is actually the microscopic aspect. When they're not microscopic, when you've got a whole bunch of it together, but their tendency to grow as tubes or cylinders or however you want to think of it. It's really that's what textiles are. That you can see that there's an advantage in being able to grow something that's like that. So think of the linen plant flax plant, for example, where linen comes from. You grow the linen and then you have to thrash it like crazy to get out these long fiber cells, and that's where linen comes from. And it's not to suggest that that's no longer going to be done, but the fungi give you more tools in the toolbox kind of to do different kinds of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just building different structures, I guess, that are natural materials. Anyways, very cool. I'm really excited to kind of see where that goes, and excited that we'll have these biodegradable materials like packing materials and things like that. So that's really cool.
Well, I think about it too is a small industry. I call it boutique biotechnology in the book. And it still requires investment. It's still there's still millions of dollars involved in doing things like this, but it's not like the huge chemical companies and so on that have billions of dollars before they get anywhere, or the drug companies. It's a smaller level thing, and it can address local concerns and local economies and local cultural sensitivities, etc., much more directly because of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. One other thing you mentioned that was really interesting to me was that you mentioned briefly that there are enzymes that fungi make that can break down plastics. And I thought I'd never heard that before, and I thought that was fascinating. Is anybody exploring that right now?
Yeah, there's people looking at that, and I think that's a long way away before we can really break down plastic the way you're thinking. What we have now are enzymes that will they alter part of the structure of the plastic. So a combination of physical treatments and treatments with enzymes, you can either repurpose the plastic and to make something else out of it, or at least get rid of the toxins that are in it.
Yeah.
Biochemically, it's a real challenge, and it's the same with lignin, which is one of the main carbohydrates in wood. Lignin is basically a plastic, and it's very difficult for living things to break it down.
Yeah. So, I thought that was exciting. I think that's our kind of biggest biochemical challenge in the world right now is what do we do with all these plastics that we've made, and how do we break them down? So, and hey, if any kingdom can do it, I think the fungi can do it, because they're so good at breaking everything else down. So maybe some combination of biotech and natural enzymes and things like that we'll get there. Anyways, that's probably a good place to wrap up. Thanks for speaking with me, Keith. I really appreciate it. I loved your book. It's so well written, and it's just so interesting. And I just felt like I walked away with such a better understanding of sort of the role that fungi play in our life. So I highly recommend it to anybody if they're interested in that.
It's great to hear that you like the book.
I loved it. You're a great writer.
I appreciate that.
So the book is coming out in
it's the end of May.
End of May. Is there anywhere else that people can find you online? Do you have like a digital presence at all, or?
I was thinking, this morning when you mentioned that you wanted to talk about these odd new uses that people are putting to fungi. Anybody that's on Flipboard, I have a Flipboard page called Fungi in the News that I tend to shovel those stories into.
Okay.
And otherwise, I'm not particularly social media savvy at the moment anyway.
Okay. So is there like a link? Is there a link that people can you could provide for that?
To Fungi in the News, sure. I can send a link, and I can send you you already have the link for the order for the book, I think.
Yeah. I'll put that up for sure. Okay, cool. So we'll add a link to that curated page in the YouTube description and the show notes for the audio version. Great. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.